The autumn morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Lawrence Potter's executive suite, casting elongated shadows across the polished marble floors of Potter Technologies headquarters. At 42, he occupied a throne of his own making, the corner office on the 30th floor, where the Philadelphia skyline stretched before him like a conquered kingdom. His desk, an imposing structure of Brazilian walnut, bore the weight of merger documents that would expand his tech empire into 3 new markets by year's end. The office walls told the story he wanted the world to believe. Awards from the Philadelphia Business Journal lined the eastern wall, their metallic surfaces reflecting the morning light in geometric patterns across the Persian rug beneath his feet. Contemporary art pieces, carefully curated by an interior designer whose fees exceeded most people's annual salaries, adorned the spaces between windows. A photograph of Lawrence shaking hands with the governor occupied the most prominent position, a testament to the political connections that had smoothed countless regulatory hurdles. Everything in this space whispered success, power, control. Lawrence adjusted his Hermes tie, the silk smooth between his fingers as he reviewed the quarterly earnings report. Potter Technologies had become synonymous with innovation in cybersecurity solutions, transforming from a modest startup into a multi-billion-dollar corporation under his leadership. 1,500 employees across 12 offices. Contracts with Fortune 500 companies. A valuation that made venture capitalists salivate. At 42, he had achieved the American dream and then surpassed it. Yet beneath the expensive cologne and tailored Tom Ford suit, Lawrence carried a weight no quarterly report could measure. 5 years of silence. 5 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice. 5 years of building his empire while trying to forget the woman he'd destroyed. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Potter," his assistant Marcus announced, his voice professionally neutral through the intercom. "Your mother is here." The mere mention of Victoria Potter caused Lawrence to straighten instinctively, his shoulders pulling back as muscle memory overrode conscious thought. His mother had that effect, a gravitational presence that demanded perfection from everyone in her orbit. Victoria swept into the office as though she owned it, which in many ways she did. Her St. John knit suit and immaculately styled silver hair represented 3 generations of old Philadelphia money, the kind of pedigree that opened doors before you even knocked. "Lawrence," she greeted, offering her cheek for the obligatory kiss. "I trust you're prepared for the board meeting this afternoon. The Lexington merger represents everything we've worked toward." He gestured toward the leather armchairs positioned before his desk like supplicants before a throne. "The documentation is finalized. Legal has reviewed every clause. We're positioned to close within 60 days. "Excellent." Victoria's approval came with a practiced smile, the kind she'd perfected over decades of charity galas and country club luncheons. "Your father would be proud of how you've expanded Potter Technologies. Robert built the foundation, but you've constructed an empire." The mention of his father sent a familiar ache through Lawrence's chest. Robert Potter had died 7 years ago, leaving behind a thriving company and expectations that weighed more than steel. He'd taught Lawrence everything about building a business, revenue models, strategic partnerships, competitive positioning, but nothing about the cost of those lessons. "The board is particularly impressed with your acquisition strategy," Victoria continued, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the armrest. "Though I must say, some of the older members questioned your decision to pursue that startup incubator program. Potter Technologies has always maintained certain standards regarding the caliber of companies we associate with. Lawrence suppressed the familiar irritation. He knew exactly what his mother meant. Potter Technologies had traditionally focused on established corporations, Fortune 500 companies with predictable revenue streams and respectable pedigrees. His initiative to mentor minority-owned tech startups had raised eyebrows among board members who equated risk with anything that challenged their comfortable assumptions. "The numbers justify the strategy, Mother," he replied, pulling up a presentation on his tablet. "We've identified 3 startups with disruptive potential. The diversity of perspective strengthens our competitive edge. Innovation doesn't wear a suit and come from legacy institutions." Victoria's expression remained carefully composed, but Lawrence recognized the calculation in her eyes. "Numbers aren't everything, darling. The Potter name has always represented stability, tradition, excellence. We've spent generations building our reputation." She paused, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. "Which reminds me, Angela Whitmore has returned from her position in London. The Whitmores are hosting a dinner party next week. It would be appropriate for you to attend." The suggestion hung in the air like expensive perfume, cloying and inescapable. Lawrence understood the subtext perfectly. At 42 and unmarried, he represented an anomaly in his mother's carefully ordered world. A successful man was supposed to have a suitable wife, children who would inherit the empire, a family that reflected his achievements. His bachelor status was a stain on an otherwise perfect resume. "I'm focused on the merger," he deflected, turning his attention back to the documents scattered across his desk. "The Lexington deal requires my full attention. Once it closes, perhaps." "Lawrence." Victoria's voice carried the steel beneath the silk. "You cannot build an empire with no one to inherit it. You're 42 years old. The Whitmores are an established family. Angela graduated from Wharton, sits on 3 nonprofit boards, and understands the responsibilities that come with our social position." He met his mother's gaze, seeing in her face the same implacable will that had shaped his entire life. Every achievement measured against impossible standards. Every decision filtered through the lens of reputation and legacy. Every relationship evaluated for strategic value rather than emotional truth. "I'll consider it," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. After Victoria's departure, Lawrence stood at his window, watching the city pulse 30 floors below. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Expensive suit, styled hair, the very image of a man who had everything. Yet behind that polished exterior, something hollow echoed with every heartbeat. His eyes drifted to the drawer in his desk, the one he never opened in front of others. Inside lay a single photograph, creased and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times over 5 years. Kathleen's face smiled up at him from that image, her hand resting on the swell of her pregnant belly. 6 months along with twins. Glowing with happiness and trust that he had shattered with accusations and cowardice. He closed the drawer without removing the photograph. Some ghosts were better left buried. The phone on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Potter," Marcus said, "your 10 a.m. is here. The site inspection team for the Chestnut Street expansion." "Send them in," Lawrence replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath his carefully maintained surface. The morning continued in its usual rhythm. Meetings, decisions, the constant performance of being Lawrence Potter, CEO. He reviewed architectural plans for the new office building. He approved the marketing budget for the fourth quarter. He negotiated contract terms with vendors who stumbled over themselves to secure Potter Technologies' business. Every action reinforced the narrative he'd constructed. Successful, focused, moving forward. But that afternoon, as he prepared for a routine drive to inspect a potential property acquisition in the northern suburbs, fate had different plans. His usual driver called in sick. The replacement took an unfamiliar route through the neighborhoods Lawrence typically avoided, the places where real people lived real lives, far from the sanitized world of boardrooms and country clubs. They stopped at a red light near Elmwood Elementary School. It was 3:15 p.m., and the sidewalks teemed with the chaos of dismissal time. Parents clustered in small groups. Children darted between adults with the fearless energy of youth, and crossing guards directed the flow of small bodies like conductors managing an unpredictable symphony. Lawrence barely glanced at the scene. His attention remained fixed on his phone, scrolling through emails that demanded responses, decisions, his perpetual attention. Then he saw her. Time compressed and expanded simultaneously. The phone slipped from his fingers, forgotten. Every sound faded except for the rushing of blood in his ears. Kathleen Black stood on the sidewalk outside the school, her elegant posture unmistakable even after 5 years. She wore a simple dress in a soft shade of blue, modest but dignified, the kind of understated grace that had first captured his attention a lifetime ago. Her hair fell in natural waves around her shoulders, and even from across the street, Lawrence could see the strength in the set of her shoulders, the way she carried herself like a woman who had survived what should have destroyed her. But it was the two small boys holding her hands that stopped Lawrence's heart entirely. Twin boys, perhaps 5 years old, with features that mirrored his own with devastating clarity. The same strong jaw, the same dark hair with that slight wave at the crown, the same intelligent eyes that now looked up at their mother with absolute trust and love. His sons, the sons he had never met, the sons whose existence he had denied himself knowledge of through 5 years of willful blindness. The sons he had abandoned when he threw their pregnant mother out of his home based on lies he had chosen to believe because believing them was easier than fighting for truth. "Stop the car," Lawrence heard himself say, his voice strange and distant. "Sir?" the driver asked, confused. "Stop the car. Now." The vehicle pulled to the curb. Lawrence's hand found the door handle, but he couldn't move. He sat frozen, watching through the windshield as Kathleen crouched down to zip up one boy's jacket, her movements tender and practiced. The other child leaned against her side, secure in the knowledge of his mother's constant presence. This was what he had thrown away. This was the price of his cowardice. Kathleen straightened, preparing to lead the boys toward the crosswalk. For just a moment, her gaze swept across the street. A casual glance, nothing more. But her eyes locked onto the Blacktown car. Then they locked onto Lawrence's face through the window. He watched recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid. One hand instinctively tightened on the nearest boy's shoulder, pulling both children closer in an unconscious gesture of protection. Her expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and then something harder, colder. The look of a woman who had learned to turn pain into armor. Lawrence pushed open the car door. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his expensive Italian shoes touching ground that suddenly felt like the edge of an abyss. Other parents were beginning to notice the expensive vehicle, the man in the suit who stood frozen on their neighborhood street looking like he'd seen a ghost. Because he had. The ghost of every choice he'd made 5 years ago. The ghost of the man he'd been before cowardice had defined him. The ghost of a future he had destroyed with his own hands. Kathleen turned as if to flee, her protective instinct warring with something else. Rage, perhaps, or the need to finally confront the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. "Mommy?" one of the boys asked, his small voice carrying across the distance. "Who is that man? Why is he staring at us?" Lawrence took a step forward. Then another. His legs moved without conscious command, carrying him across the street toward the family he had discarded, toward the reckoning he had spent 5 years trying to avoid. He could see details now that distance had obscured. The slight wear on Kathleen's dress that spoke of careful budgeting. The backpacks the boys wore, clearly second-hand but meticulously maintained. The way all three of them carried themselves with dignity despite circumstances that never should have been their burden. This was the life he had condemned them to. This was what his cowardice had cost. "Kathleen," he managed to say, her name foreign on his tongue after 5 years of silence. She didn't respond. She simply stood there, her arms protectively encircling their son's, her eyes holding his with an intensity that stripped away every defense he'd constructed. And in that moment, standing on a sidewalk outside an elementary school, while his carefully constructed world crumbled around him, Lawrence Potter finally understood the true cost of the empire he had built. The story had begun 5 years ago with a terrible choice. But it would end here, on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when the past he had buried finally demanded its reckoning. The question was whether he had the courage now to face what he had lacked the courage to defend then. Behind him, the driver waited patiently in the idling car. Around him, other parents continued their routines, unaware that they were witnessing the moment a man's entire existence shattered and reformed simultaneously. And before him stood the woman he had wronged and the sons he had never met, their presence a testament to survival, strength, and the price of choosing comfort over character. Lawrence Potter stood at the threshold of transformation, though whether it would lead to redemption or merely to a deeper understanding of his own failures remained to be seen. Some sins could not be undone with tears or money or belated remorse. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could be the beginning of learning what it truly meant to be worthy of the family he had thrown away. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and in those shadows, Lawrence saw clearly for the first time in 5 years. He had built an empire while destroying everything that actually mattered. Now he would have to live with that truth, standing before the 3 people whose lives he had irrevocably altered, waiting to see if accountability could ever become redemption. Chapter 1: The Empire Built on Silence. 5 years ago, Lawrence Potter had made a choice that would define the rest of his life, though he told himself it was necessity rather than cowardice. The morning Kathleen had tried to show him the ultrasound images of their twins, his mother Victoria had arrived at their home with David Chan, his business partner, carrying a manila envelope that would poison everything it touched. The photographs inside showed Kathleen at a cafe with another man, their heads close together in what Victoria called obvious intimacy. David had discovered them during what he termed routine security monitoring of company executives' families. The timestamps showed multiple meetings over several weeks. The narrative they constructed was damning and deliberate. Lawrence could still remember Kathleen's face when he confronted her, 6 months pregnant and exhausted from carrying twins. She had tried to explain that the man was her brother Marcus, recently returned from military deployment overseas, someone Lawrence had never met because their whirlwind courtship had happened while Marcus was stationed in Germany. But Victoria's voice had been louder, more insistent. David's evidence more compelling than his wife's desperate denials. In the end, Lawrence had chosen the easier path. He chose to believe the lie because believing it meant he could focus on the company without the distraction of family complications. Potter Technologies was negotiating its largest acquisition, and the timing of a pregnancy with twins felt inconvenient. Victoria had made it simple. A clean break, a generous settlement to avoid scandal, and Kathleen would sign away all claims to his name and fortune. Except Kathleen had refused the settlement. She had walked out with nothing but her dignity and the clothes on her back, choosing poverty over blood money. Lawrence had told himself she was being foolish, that her pride would crumble eventually. He had expected her to return, contrite and willing to accept his terms. She never did. Instead, Lawrence had thrown himself into building his empire. Potter Technologies had tripled in value under his leadership. The Lexington merger had opened international markets. His name appeared in Forbes and Fortune. Victoria had orchestrated his entry into Philadelphia's most exclusive social circles, and David Chun had become his most trusted advisor, the man who had saved him from making a terrible mistake. But late at night, in the silence of his penthouse apartment, Lawrence would open that drawer and look at the photograph of Kathleen smiling with her hand on her pregnant belly. He had built everything on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation had cracked open on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, revealing the truth he had spent 5 years trying to bury. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Rebuilt Herself. Kathleen Black had learned that survival required 3 things: relentless determination, the ability to function on 4 hours of sleep, and the capacity to turn humiliation into fuel. The night Lawrence threw her out, 6 months pregnant with twins and nowhere to go, she had stood on the sidewalk outside their townhouse watching the lights go dark behind expensive curtains. She had $23 in her purse, the clothes on her back, and 2 lives growing inside her that depended entirely on her refusal to break. The women's shelter on Broad Street became her home for 3 months. She slept in a narrow cot, her swollen belly making it impossible to find comfort, while the sounds of other women's nightmares echoed through thin walls. The shelter staff had been kind but overwhelmed, their resources stretched impossibly thin. Kathleen had filled out endless paperwork for assistance programs, sat in clinic waiting rooms for prenatal care, and learned to navigate a system designed to humble the desperate. Marcus and Elijah were born on a February morning. Their arrival 8 hours of agony that Kathleen endured alone because she had no one to call. The hospital social worker had looked at her with practiced pity, offering pamphlets about adoption services and single mother support groups. Kathleen had held her sons and felt something harder than diamond form in her chest. These boys would never know hunger. They would never doubt their worth. They would never believe their father's abandonment reflected anything about their value. She found work cleaning office buildings at night, her babies strapped to her chest in carriers, while she scrubbed toilets and emptied trash bins. During the day, she waitressed at a diner near the university, surviving on tips and leftover breakfast specials. On weekends, she worked retail at a department store, folding clothes with mechanical precision while her feet screamed in protest. 3 jobs, 70-hour weeks, Every penny counted, every sacrifice measured against her son's needs. The boys grew despite their circumstances, bright-eyed and curious, their laughter the only luxury Kathleen allowed herself. She read to them every night, books borrowed from the library that transported them beyond their cramped studio apartment. She taught them their letters and numbers, how to tie their shoes and say please and thank you. She never spoke their father's name, but she never taught them to hate him either. By the time Marcus and Elijah started kindergarten at Elmwood Elementary, Kathleen had clawed her way to stability. She had managed to secure a position as an administrative assistant, work that paid enough for a modest apartment and clothes that didn't come from donation bins. She had built a life from nothing, and she had done it alone. Then Lawrence Potter's face appeared across the street, and 5 years of carefully constructed armor cracked wide open. Chapter 3. The Lie That Destroyed Everything. The morning everything shattered had started like any other. Kathleen had woken early, her 6-month pregnant belly making sleep increasingly difficult, and prepared breakfast while Lawrence showered for work. She had been excited to show him the new ultrasound images from her appointment the previous day, clear pictures of their twin boys that made her heart ache with anticipation. Victoria Potter had arrived unannounced at 8 o'clock, her perfectly composed face carrying an expression Kathleen had learned to dread. David Chin followed close behind, his usual friendly demeanor replaced with something cold and professional. They carried a manila envelope like it was evidence at a trial. Lawrence had emerged from the bedroom, his confusion at their presence quickly morphing into concern when Victoria laid the photographs across the breakfast table. Images of Kathleen at a cafe with a man, their heads bent close in conversation, hands touching across the table. Multiple meetings over 3 weeks, each one documented with timestamps and locations. David explained in measured tones how he had discovered the affair during routine security, monitoring how he had agonized over whether to tell Lawrence, how he felt obligated to protect his friend and business partner. Kathleen had stared at the photographs, recognition flooding through her with relief. "That's Marcus," she had said, her voice steady despite the accusation hanging in the air. "My brother. He's been deployed in Germany for 2 years. He came home on leave." But Victoria had cut her off with surgical precision. "Your brother. How convenient. A man you've never mentioned in 3 years of marriage suddenly appears, and you meet him in secret repeatedly. Lawrence, she didn't tell you about any of these meetings, did she?" The truth was she hadn't, because Marcus's leave had been a surprise and she had wanted to plan a proper introduction, to bridge the gap between her husband's world and the brother who still wore his uniform to civilian restaurants out of habit. But standing there, 6 months pregnant and facing her mother-in-law's cold certainty, that truth sounded exactly like a lie. Lawrence had looked at her with something worse than anger, disappointment mixed with relief. She had seen it in his eyes, the way this accusation provided an escape from the complications of impending fatherhood. Potter Technologies was in the middle of crucial negotiations. Twins meant disruption, demand, divided attention. "I want you out," he had said, his voice flat and final. "Today," Kathleen had begged. She had shown him Marcus's military ID in her wallet, offered to call her brother immediately, pleaded for him to simply listen. But Victoria's voice had been louder, David's evidence more compelling, and Lawrence's cowardice more powerful than any truth she could offer. By nightfall, she had been standing on the sidewalk, homeless and 6 months pregnant, watching the man she loved choose the easier lie over the harder truth. Chapter 4. The Tuesday morning collision. Lawrence's usual driver had called in sick that Tuesday morning, an inconvenience that seemed minor at the time. The replacement driver, unfamiliar with Lawrence's preferred routes, had taken them through neighborhoods that Lawrence typically avoided, places where chain-link fences replaced manicured hedges and corner stores outnumbered coffee boutiques. Lawrence had barely noticed, his attention fixed on his phone as he scrolled through emails about the Lexington merger. The property inspection in the northern suburbs required his signature on environmental assessments. Standard procedure. Another task in a day filled with tasks. The car had stopped at a red light near Elmwood Elementary just as dismissal time released a flood of children onto the sidewalks. Lawrence had glanced up from his phone with mild irritation at the delay, his gaze sweeping across the chaos of parents and children with the detachment of someone whose world existed 30 floors above such mundane concerns. Then his eyes had locked onto a woman in a soft blue dress, and the phone slipped from his fingers. Kathleen. Even after 5 years, he knew her instantly. The elegant line of her neck, the way she stood with her weight slightly on her left hip, the natural grace that no amount of hardship could diminish. She was thinner than he remembered, her face carrying a mature beauty that spoke of trials survived rather than avoided. But it was the two boys holding her hands that stopped Lawrence's heart entirely. They couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Identical twins with dark hair and features that hit Lawrence like a physical blow. The boy on Kathleen's right had his exact nose, the same slight hook at the bridge that Lawrence had inherited from his father. The other child possessed Lawrence's distinctive eyebrows, thick and expressive. Both boys had that familiar set to their jaw, the Potter jawline that appeared in generations of family photographs. His sons. The mathematical certainty crashed through him with devastating clarity. 5 years ago, Kathleen had been 6 months pregnant when he threw her out. These boys were exactly the right age. These were the twins she had tried to show him in ultrasound images he had refused to look at. Lawrence watched as Kathleen crouched down to zip up one boy's jacket, her movements practiced and tender. The other child leaned against her side with absolute trust, secure in the knowledge of his mother's constant presence. They were a complete unit, the three of them, functioning with the synchronized ease of people who had only ever had each other. Everything Lawrence had built, the empire, the reputation, the carefully curated success, suddenly felt hollow against this single devastating truth. He had sons. He had always had sons, and they had grown up without him not because of Kathleen's betrayal, but because of his own cowardice. "Stop the car," Lawrence heard himself say, his voice strange and distant. "Now." Chapter 5. These are your sons. Kathleen's entire body went rigid the moment she saw him. Lawrence watched her hand tighten protectively on the nearest boy's shoulder, pulling both children closer in an instinctive gesture that spoke of 5 years spent as their sole defender. Her expression cycled through shock, disbelief, and then something harder, the look of a woman who had learned to weaponize her pain. Lawrence pushed open the car door, his legs unsteady as expensive Italian shoes touched ordinary pavement. Other parents were beginning to notice the black town car, the man in the $1,000 suit who stood frozen on their neighborhood street looking like he'd witnessed his own death. Kathleen turned as if to flee, her protective instinct warring with something else. Rage, perhaps, or the need to finally confront the ghost that had haunted 5 years of her life. "Mommy?" the boy on her right asked, his small voice carrying across the distance with devastating clarity. "Who is that man? Why is he staring at us?" Lawrence forced his legs to move. One step, then another. The sidewalk stretched before him like an impossible distance, though it was barely 20 feet. Each step carried the weight of 5 years of willful blindness, of choosing comfort over truth, of building an empire while his sons grew up without knowing his name. He could see details now that distance had obscured. The slight wear on Kathleen's dress spoke of careful budgeting, each dollar stretched to cover necessities. The boys' backpacks were clearly secondhand but meticulously maintained, the fabric faded but clean. Yet all three of them carried themselves with dignity that no amount of hardship had managed to diminish. "Kathleen," he managed, her name foreign on his tongue after 5 years of silence. She didn't respond. Her arms encircled their sons more tightly, her body a shield between Lawrence and the children he had abandoned. Her eyes held his with an intensity that stripped away every defense, every justification, every lie he had told himself to sleep at night. Marcus, Elijah. The names emerged broken from his throat, pieces of information he had no right to possess. He had learned them from the private investigator's report he had commissioned 2 years ago in a moment of weakness, then buried in that locked drawer alongside his conscience. The boys looked up at their mother with confusion. Around them, other parents had stopped their conversations, sensing drama unfolding. A woman with a stroller had paused on the corner. A father holding a kindergartner's hand stood frozen, witnessing the moment a man's carefully constructed world shattered completely. "These are your sons," Kathleen said finally, her voice steady despite the devastation in her eyes. "The ones you said didn't exist." Chapter 6. The truth comes out. Kathleen's composure cracked like ice under pressure. 5 years of suppressed rage finally finding its voice. "You want to know their names now? You want to stand here in your expensive suit and pretend you have any right to them?" Her voice rose with each word, drawing more attention from the gathering crowd of parents. "You threw me out, Lawrence. 6 months pregnant. And you threw me out like garbage." Lawrence opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. What defense could possibly exist for what he had done? "Your mother brought those photographs," Kathleen continued, her words sharp enough to draw blood. "David Chun with his convenient security monitoring. And you believed them. You chose to believe I was having an affair rather than simply ask me who the man in those pictures was. Do you know who he was, Lawrence?" "Your brother?" Lawrence whispered, the truth he had learned too late sitting like ash in his mouth. "Marcus. He was on leave from deployment." "My brother," Kathleen confirmed, her voice breaking slightly before hardening again. "My brother who I was planning to introduce to you properly. But you didn't give me the chance to explain. You looked at those doctored timestamps and convenient angles and decided it was easier to believe the worst than to trust your wife." The boys pressed closer to their mother, frightened by her tone but unable to look away from the stranger who had made her voice shake with emotion. Marcus, the smaller twin, reached up to pat Kathleen's hand in a gesture of comfort that destroyed Lawrence more effectively than any accusation could. "I begged you," Kathleen said, tears now streaming down her face unchecked. "I showed you Marcus's military ID. I offered to call him right then. But your mother was so convincing, wasn't she? And David with his evidence. It was easier to believe them than to fight for me." "Kathleen, Lawrence started, but she cut him off with devastating precision. "I was carrying your babies, Lawrence. Your sons. And you called me a whore." The word hung in the air like a slap. "You told me to get rid of them, that you wouldn't raise another man's children. Do you remember that? Do you remember what you said to me?" Lawrence's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees on the sidewalk, his carefully maintained composure shattering completely. Sobs tore from his chest, 5 years of guilt and denial finally overwhelming the walls he had built. Other parents turned away from the spectacle, uncomfortable witnesses to a man's complete breakdown. "I'm sorry," he choked out, though the words felt pathetically inadequate. "God, Kathleen, I'm so sorry." But sorry couldn't undo 5 years. Sorry couldn't give his sons back their father or return to Kathleen the life he had stolen. Chapter 7. 2 Boys and a Stranger. Marcus and Elijah stared at the crying man on the sidewalk with the bewildered fascination of children confronting something beyond their comprehension. They had seen adults cry before. Their mother, late at night when she thought they were sleeping, her quiet sobs muffled by pillows, but never like this. Never a stranger in an expensive suit collapsing in public, his grief raw and uncontained. Elijah, always the bolder of the twins, tugged on Kathleen's dress. "Mommy, why is that man crying? Did we make him sad?" The question pierced through Lawrence's breakdown, the innocence of it more devastating than any accusation. These boys, his sons, were wondering if they had somehow caused a stranger's pain. They had no concept of the man who should have been there for their first steps, their first words, their first days of school. "No, baby," Kathleen said, her voice softening as maternal instinct overrode her rage. She crouched down to their eye level, positioning herself between the boys and Lawrence. "This man, he's someone from Mommy's past, someone who made some very bad choices." Marcus, the more observant twin, studied Lawrence with those intelligent eyes that mirrored his own. "Is he our daddy?" The question emerged with the directness only children possessed, cutting through pretense to the truth that adults danced around. Kathleen's breath caught. She had always known this conversation would come eventually, but not here, not now, not with Lawrence sobbing on a public sidewalk while their neighbors watched. "Yes," she said finally, because she had never lied to her sons and wouldn't start now. "He is." Elijah's face scrunched in confusion. "But daddies are supposed to live with their families. Teacher says her daddy comes to pick her up sometimes. Why doesn't our daddy live with us?" Lawrence looked up at his sons through tears, seeing the question in their identical faces. "Why didn't you come find us? Why weren't you there? Where were you when we needed you?" "I made a mistake," Lawrence managed, his voice broken. "The biggest mistake of my life. I wasn't there because I was wrong and scared, and I chose to believe lies instead of fighting for the truth." "But why didn't you come back?" Marcus asked, his small face serious. "When you knew you made a mistake, why didn't you come find us? Mommy says when you make mistakes, you're supposed to fix them." The simplicity of the question destroyed what remained of Lawrence's composure. Why hadn't he come looking? Because it was easier to pretend they didn't exist than to face what he had done. Because his empire required his attention and his guilt required burial. Because he was a coward. "I don't have a good answer," Lawrence admitted, the truth more painful than any lie. I should have come looking for you every single day." Chapter 8. The Cost of Cowardice. Lawrence spent 3 days systematically dismantling the lie that had shaped 5 years of his life. He hired a forensic digital analyst who confirmed what he had already known in his heart. The photographs David Chun had presented were manipulated, the timestamps altered, the metadata doctored with professional precision. The cafe meetings were real, but the intimacy suggested by carefully cropped angles was fiction. A single phone call to military records verified Marcus Black's deployment timeline and leave dates, information Lawrence could have obtained 5 years ago with minimal effort. The confrontation with Victoria took place in her pristine Main Line estate, where generations of Potter family portraits watched from gilded frames. She had tried to maintain her composure when Lawrence laid the evidence before her, but something in his face must have warned her that charm and manipulation would no longer work. "You destroyed my family," Lawrence said, his voice unnaturally calm. "You fabricated evidence, manipulated photographs, and convinced me to throw out my pregnant wife. Why?" Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculation beneath. "She wasn't suitable, Lawrence. A woman with no family connections, no social standing. You were building an empire. You needed someone who could enhance the Potter name, not dilute it. She was my wife. They are my sons. They would have been distractions," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting she still believed she had acted appropriately. "You've accomplished so much without that burden. Potter Technologies has tripled in value. Your position too." Lawrence walked out before she could finish, the door closing on a relationship that had controlled his life for 42 years. David Chun offered no denials when confronted, only excuses about protecting Lawrence's focus during crucial business negotiations. Lawrence fired him on the spot, security escorting his former partner from the building, while employees whispered behind cubicle walls. The board meeting where Lawrence announced his resignation sent shockwaves through Potter Technologies. He was selling his majority shares, stepping down as CEO, and establishing a trust fund that would provide for his son's education, healthcare, and future. The amount was substantial enough to make the board members shift uncomfortably. 8 figures representing 5 years of child support he had never paid, invested with compound interest. His attorney had tried to explain that such gestures weren't legally required, that Lawrence's name wasn't even on the birth certificates, that he had no obligation. "I know," Lawrence had replied. "That's exactly why I have to do it." But as he signed the documents that dismantled his empire, Lawrence understood with brutal clarity that money couldn't purchase redemption. It couldn't give his sons back their father or return the years Kathleen had spent working 3 jobs to survive. It was merely the cost of his cowardice, a price that could be calculated but never truly paid. Chapter 9. The Beginning of Accountability. Kathleen's terms arrived through her attorney 3 weeks after the sidewalk confrontation, typed on formal letterhead that created distance where emotions still ran too raw. Supervised visits, 2 hours every Saturday afternoon at a neutral location. Family therapy for everyone involved, including individual counseling for the boys. No gifts beyond reasonable birthday and holiday presents. No attempts to buy affection or assuage guilt through material means. And most importantly, no promises about the future. Lawrence would prove his commitment through consistent action, not empty words. Lawrence signed the agreement without negotiation, understanding that these boundaries were both punishment and protection. He had forfeited the right to easy access to his sons the moment he threw their mother out 5 years ago. The first supervised visit took place at a community center's family room, a space designed for exactly these uncomfortable reunions between children and parents, rebuilding broken bonds. A social worker named Patricia sat discreetly in the corner with a clipboard, observing and documenting everything for the court-mandated reports. Marcus and Elijah arrived holding Kathleen's hands, their small faces uncertain as they entered the room where Lawrence waited. He had agonized over what to wear, ultimately choosing jeans and a simple sweater, clothes that wouldn't remind them of the crying stranger in the expensive suit who had disrupted their safe sidewalk world. "Hi," Lawrence said, his voice catching slightly. Such an inadequate greeting for sons he was meeting for the first time as their father. "Hi," Elijah replied politely, the word carrying the careful courtesy Kathleen had clearly taught them. Marcus remained silent, his observant eyes cataloging everything about this man who claimed paternity. They spent the first hour in awkward attempts at connection. Lawrence asked about school, their favorite subjects, what they liked to do for fun. The boys answered with the brevity of children talking to strangers, their responses polite but guarded. Kathleen sat across the room, her presence a silent fortress they could retreat to if needed. Then Marcus asked the question that shattered Lawrence's carefully prepared script. "Are you going to leave again?" The room went silent. Patricia's pen paused on her clipboard. Kathleen's entire body tensed, ready to intervene if Lawrence's answer proved inadequate. Lawrence looked at his son, seeing in that small face the same fear Kathleen must have carried every day, that people who claimed to love you could simply disappear. He thought about all the promises he could make, the assurances he could offer, the words that might temporarily comfort. Instead, he said, "I can't promise what tomorrow looks like, Marcus, but I can promise that I'll be here next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and I'll keep coming back until you believe it." "But what if you get busy?" Elijah asked, his voice small. "Mommy says important people are always busy." "Then I'll make time anyway," Lawrence replied, holding his son's identical gazes. "Because nothing is more important than this."